An aha from Charlotte. Students' background knowledge across the grade levels. A question. How do we support students who are new to the school and or CKLA? Great question. So how do I help a fifth grade teacher who might be starting CKLA for the first time? And background knowledge is great, but how do we build that if we're starting this in fourth or fifth grade? We will get to that once we get to the fourth grade unit. Are we waiting for more people? Do you know? Okay, I'll give a few more minutes.
Yes, Annie and Julie. Yes.
Good morning, Annie.
Hi, Kevin. I'm sorry to be a couple of minutes late. Hi, everyone.
We're just starting with a do now, thinking about what's an aha when you were looking at the units, or what's a lingering question that you still have.
Are people putting that in chat?
Yep, you
or
can
are they getting ready?
come off mute or put it in the chat.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me pull up document.
To extend Paula's comment, I'm thinking about how apprenticing students into writing includes looking at reading as mentor text for language features. Absolutely. And then when you were thinking about the fourth grade unit, did you look at the text complexity rubric? Did everyone see the text complexity rubric? Any ahas or questions about the text complexity rubric? It's in the participant notebook. Let me open that up. It is page 17 of the participant notebook. I find this to be really helpful because when we think about complex text, sometimes we can often say like, this is too difficult for my students. In CKLA, rather than saying this is too difficult for my students, we really want to spot like what specifically makes this text complex. Is it the text structure, meaning how it's organized, the text features, the graphics? Is it the language features, the vocabulary, or the sentence structure? Is it the purpose, or is it the knowledge demands? So thinking about like, if it is a specific part that's really complex, how do we support that? So when we get to that fourth grade unit assessment, thinking about what specifically makes this text complex, and then how could we scaffold that? Once we know what makes it complex, then we can provide scaffolds to help support that. And good morning, Julie. We're just starting with a do now, and then we will jump in and get started. And you can come off mute or write it in the chat.
I put it in the chat, but I'll also come off mute and say, I'm curious, this wouldn't be teacher facing guidance. This I think would be more for schools, but I'm curious whether or not, and if so, how you all offer guidance about the way that, because the units are so knowledge heavy and go, pretty deep into science content, pretty deep into history content. That's what makes, I think, like makes it interesting and rich. Do you offer guidance to districts and schools about how those units sit relative to whatever science materials they have or social studies materials they have, how those your units that touch on that content relate to their social studies and science standards and curriculum, and how the two intersect? That was one of my questions.
About how we communicate with them about like navigating their science and social studies units.
Relative to the content that that we teach in CKLA on those same subject areas.
So we tell them that it is strictly a literature curriculum. Yes, there's a lot of cross curriculum. We tell them to teach that in order as they see. So don't mix up the CKLA units. but I know that some teachers will like move science units to after this. So like for fourth grade, because this is a geology unit, if they have a science unit that is geology focused, they'd move it after that unit. So we kind of just say like, if you want to reorganize things, don't have reorganize the ELA, reorganize the science or social studies.
Got it. Thank you.
And I see Paula's question, how do we support newcomers in upper elementary when they don't have K2 skills foundational? Fantastic question. We can talk about what is available to them. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our session today. I've met all of you before, but let me just introduce myself. My name is Kevin Thomas. I'm lead professional learning specialist at Amplify. I was a classroom teacher for 12 years. I taught CKLA for 5 of those years. I taught in private, public, and charter schools. My undergraduate was in elementary and special education, and my master's was in education technology. We have some norms for today's session. One, participate actively. It is going to be a lot of participation, so I'll kind of go over what's in the unit internalization, and then we'll walk through it. Take care of yourself. If you need to excuse yourself, please feel free. Manage your technology, stay engaged, and lastly, what is learned here leaves here. I put that participant notebook in the chat. It is a smart PDF, meaning that you can type in it. So once we are finished with this session, you can go ahead and save it, and then you will have that document for to reference. And then anytime you see this orange rectangle in the top right-hand corner, that just tells you what page number we will be on in the participant notebook. We have 3 objectives for today's session. 1, identify key concepts from the unit and lesson planning that have the deepened product knowledge. So we'll think about how do we plan for this unit? Also, how do we plan for a lesson? Apply the unit and lesson internalization process confidently with schools and districts. Examine the shifts that educators need to make when implementing CKLA. And our agenda for today, we'll start with that first grade skills strand. We'll look at the second grade knowledge strand, and then we will finish with the fourth grade integrated strand. This is that literacy rope, which I believe we're all familiar with. When we're thinking about K2, we want to think about the knowledge strand is where we're working on this language comprehension, being background knowledge, vocabulary, sentences, reasoning, mental models. And then in the skills strand is where we're developing this word recognition, which would be their sounds, their letters, their words, their decoding, their encoding. And so for this first unit, we are going to look at first grade skills 2. This is in the PD library. Show me a thumbs up if you've explored the PD library at all. Let me show you where the PD library is. There's a lot of helpful information included in the PD library, a lot of helpful planning documents. So if you click programs and apps, you're looking for this orange icon, PD library. And then once you're in the PD library, we want to click CKLA. And then from here, there are planning documents for the digital experience, for language, for pacing, for reading, for planning. So there's a lot of documents here. One of them is this K2 skills progression. So in here, you can see all the kindergarten, first grade, and second grade skills units. I do want to call out here, so we're reading first grade unit 2. Notice here that this is still overlapping with kindergarten. So the first 2 units of first grade for skills are reviewing everything that they learned in kindergarten. So there's no additional or no new parts of that code in the first 2 units in skills. A lot of it is just overlap or reviewing. And so in kindergarten, they're learning CVC words, CCVC, CCVCC, consonants, sounds, consonant digraphs, and then the double lettering. And then those first 2 units are just going to be reviewing that. Yes, and then the first 3 in 2nd grade are also all reviewing everything from 1st grade and 2nd grade. So it's really accounting for that summer slope. Yes, and so how to get there. Once you are in Amplify, click Programs and Apps. And then you'll see the PD library. It's that orange square. And then within the PD library, there are a lot of kind of tabs over here for what to look at. We want reading. And then once it opens up reading, we're going to click the Kate, you'll see here, reading lesson routines. We want the foundational skills. And it's going to be this K2 at a glance. But there are a lot of materials within the PD library. It's helpful. Some teachers might not know that it's in here. And so one of the first places can you put the link in the chat first? I don't know if this link will work because it's a PDF.
Of just the PD library, itself. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm not sure if that link will work either. Does that link work? I never know when I log in with my own personal, or like my login, if it will take you to it or if it will.
Yeah, we need to log in.
Do you have your Amplify? Do you have the Amplify logins?
You gave us ones 2 days ago. So if those still work and are still the right ones from that spreadsheet that you had shared with us, we could use those again.
And then on that spreadsheet, you'll notice that this blue column is students. We probably won't use that today. That's, and I can kind of hide that or move that. But you'll want this co-teacher account, and you can use any of the numbers 1 through 15. And then if you want to just put your name here, you can do that. And then I also want to, as you're logging in, I also want to call out here for the skills lesson study. The back of the K2 skills readers has something called this code knowledge assumed at the beginning of this reader. This is really helpful because it's going to tell you all of the vowels and all of the consonants that are included in this reader. So students need to know their 5 short vowels, They also need to know all of their consonants, and then also some of these digraphs. And then it also has all of the tricky words. So these readers are 100% decodable, meaning that every sound that is in this reader has either been explicitly taught or taught as a tricky word. And then at the bottom here, it tells you what is gradually being introduced. So students learn E, that long E sound is in B. They learn the tricky word he. They learn the tricky word we, she, their. So this is a really helpful guide for teachers as they start teaching the new skills unit. Okay, so let's jump in to our unit planning. This was for 1st grade skills 2. And the first says, what foundational skills will students have to master to be successful in this unit? What will students need?
E.
Fantastic. And I see, Annie, I see your question. And for parents who purchased
It's
readers.
not a question. It's
Oh,
just helpful. It's helpful for all users. As a parent who purchased these readers for my kid to have more decodable text in grade 1.
oh, really? I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yes, it is helpful for everyone. And just practicing foundational skills like before the reader, I always tell teachers, like, you know exactly what sounds are in this book. And so you can explicitly teach these, you can practice blending these. So when they have the reader, it's something that they've practiced. And yes,
Speaking of parent engagement and the readers, programs that I've used in the past have sort of blackline masters of decodables so that you can make little booklets and send them home. Is that something that is an option with these readers?
yeah, so they, I would say the activity book has and let me pull up the activity book. Give me 1 second. So the activity book has a lot of send home. Anything that says take home here at the top is something that's intended to be taken home. It might not be the entire story. It might be snippets, but a lot of the activity book has so many things that can be sent home. And we'll get to this throughout, but anything that says send, take home, rip it out and take it home, they are perforated. But then even like the pausing point activities, you'll notice here for there's so many pausing point activities, and I tell teachers when we're planning, look at the pausing point activities, because at the end of this unit, if you just send it home, chances are the parents will not open it. Some might, but they won't. And so rip it out and send everything home that students can practice to read, because you might not get to pausing point page 36, but having them read this at home is really going to help them. But there's not like a black line masters with every single one printed out, but they are embedded throughout the unit. And so they're just in the activity book. All right, so the first is they will need to know the long E sound, and it's that EE. Now I have a question. We talked about how students are introduced to the most common, least tricky spellings first. Why do you think the first long E sound they learn is this EE?
Must be the most common.
You think it's the most common? Is that what you said?
That's what I'm guessing based on the power bar situation and the
And it's funny because it's actually not very common, but it's the least tricky, just because the E by itself is actually much more common, but to avoid that confusion with and E, the E by itself making the long E is introduced later. So this is a much less common version, but that's when it goes into that most common, least tricky. This is less tricky because it's that vowel digraph, 2 vowels make 1 sound. And then the other is that long A, long I, long O, and long U sound. Number 2, what does the introduction tell us to consider when teaching this unit? Any considerations?
Well, I was looking at the like magic E and silent E because I know teachers go back and forth with that. So I really liked seeing that justification there.
Absolutely. I work in Texas a lot, and Texas, the teachers that I talked about, they said their district doesn't let them use magic E, and I said that it actually is not the end of the world if they don't say magic E. It is really just kind of a way to say this this E is making the vowel say its name. So if they want to call it a silent E, it's okay, but I think most teachers have used magic E.
I also really liked the marking, the pointing marking feedback. Like I've done the pointing like this, and then the like connection, like, well, if you mark it with like the little V, it mirrors what your fingers are doing when you point. That was helpful to me, and something I hadn't actually thought about.
Absolutely. Let me, I'm gonna confuse all of my tabs. And then again, using that term magic E instead of silent E. What additional materials are needed for the implementation of this unit?
Their code chart.
The code chart?
Green markers.
Yep. So, and all of these, the green markers are for vowels. So when they're introducing the consonants, remember in that code chart, consonants are going to be red, vowels are going to be green, and R controlled are going to be blue. That's just to kind of help identify the when they get into the syllables, if they are R controlled or a special type of syllable. So for this unit, they're learning all vowels, so they'll need that green marker or green crayon. Supplies for the tricky words. Tricky word walls are really helpful just so that they can practice it, and this could be foundational skills practice at the beginning. A timer, and then the digital components. What materials are in the teacher resource sections? The teacher resource section. And the teacher resource section is at the very back of the teacher's guide. So it is on, and there's a lot in the skills units. There are a lot of resources. So the teacher resources starts on, if you're looking at the PDF, it's page 252. And it has all of these. So the anecdotal reading record for unit 2, discussing, and we'll look at all of these as well. The discussion questions observation, the tricky word caregiver letter, the tricky word flashcards, the tricky word assessment record, the tricky word assessment list, the assessment record, the additional support activity pages, and the activity book answer key. And so here is that anecdotal reading record. This is really helpful. This is by student. And so you can think about, if I have a few students, I took a anecdotal reading record during lesson 3, and then lesson 5, and then lesson 7, and I'm listening for, do they know all of these new sounds? Are they having any trouble spots? They also have the discussion questions. These are helpful, again, just for equity of students, so that I'm not calling on the same 5 students all the time. I can think about, okay, which lesson is this? And did I call on every student? Am I having an equity of voice from everyone? This is really helpful just because as a teacher, it can be easy to call on the same 4 students that have their hand raised all the time. In CKLA, we really want to prioritize giving wait time and also having a turn and talk time. So it's not just, all right, what's this comprehension question? But ask the question, give a minute to think, then have them turn and talk with a peanut butter and jelly partner, or a partner A, partner B, and then have a few people share out. The tricky caregiver letter, some tricky word flashcards to send home, practice.
I did have a question, Kevin, for the tricky word letter, is that available in other languages?
Let me see. I know in Caminos it would be in Spanish, but I'm not sure if this is in Spanish. I'm not sure. I have to check. Let me make a note. I know that they have the not this caregiver letter, but the introduction caregiver letters in Spanish, but I'm not sure about for this one. the flashcards to be sent home or practiced in school.
Kevin, and the tricky word letter, at least the one in English, is it's giving. Let me see. Okay. Okay. That's helpful. Part of what I was wondering is so many parents have the scheme of just like running cards like this. And so I was wondering what we're sharing with families about we like decode what we can decode. And we're just trying like that piece I felt like in the teacher guidance was helpful. And so it's helpful to see the language that goes to
Absolutely.
families.
So the tricky part of the word is the underlined part here. Same thing that they have in their reader there. And so just kind of calling that out. And again, we wouldn't think of the word I as tricky, but it is because we learn I makes the I. And so until they learn the long vowels, that is considered a tricky word. And then here is the record for how many tricky words they know at the beginning of the unit and then at the end of the unit. And then this is what the students would have in front of them for those tricky words. The additional support pages, I always tell teachers when you're planning the unit, look at the additional support pages because again, these units can go by very quickly. And so there are a lot of additional materials in here that you might not have time to practice during class time. But if you have morning work or if you have an extra day or whichever it might be, put a sticky note in your teacher's guide to know like, oh, I do want to use this. I might not have time this week, but I want to come back to this specific page. These are for additional support activities. This is for a Silly Voices game. This is for practicing phonemes, the word week, week. This is like a call and response. So partner A reads part of it, partner B reads part of it. And I'm just going through like for this, I'm just kind of walking through whatever is included in the teacher resources section. So just saying that like when you do start to plan for this, kind of look at, there are a lot of things in here, and because it's not in the beginning of the teacher's guide, I think sometimes teachers won't go to it. For the sake of this, it's helpful just to say like, what is this? How could a teacher use this in their instruction or sending it home? Some more phonological and phonemic awareness. Let me zoom out a little bit and see. Within the teacher resource section, there are 17, and this is different than the pausing point activities. There are 17 kind of activities to think about, or games, or so activities, games, worksheets. So just look at these when you are planning to think about where might my students need some additional practice. They also have the activity book answer key. And so these are all of the student activity book pages. So 1.1, 1.2, and all of the answers. And so these are, they all start on page 252 for that, what is included in the teacher resource section. Any questions about the teacher resource section? Number 5 on that planning document says, thinking about possible misconceptions, let's look at the pausing points. Now, the pausing points are, we can find those in the activity book. Let me put the activity book here. Does everyone know how to access the activity books?
Tell us, please.
So if I click programs and apps, I want to click CKLA. And then within CKLA, we will want to switch to first grade. And so from first grade, we're going to click skills 2. If you click read more here, this is going to be all of the unit introduction, which we just kind of read about in the beginning of the teacher's guide. We're going to scroll down past all of the lessons, and then we want to open that activity book. You'll see it under materials. Was everybody able to locate that? Okay. So for the activity book, let me start from the top. With the activity book pages, each page is numbered 1.1. That first number is going to tell you what lesson it's associated with. So I can tell you this is lesson 1. That second number is going to be which activity is this for lesson 1. So this is lesson 1, activity 1. And then I can see here, this is lesson 1, activity 2. So grand trip is lesson 1, activity 2. And then if I keep scrolling, lesson 1, activity 3 is the take home material. And I know it's take home because at the top right, it says take home. And it's a caregiver letter and it will say what to practice. And then if I keep scrolling, I'll see here, lesson 2, activity 1. For the pausing point activities, because that's what we're looking at for now, all of the pausing points are going to be at the end of this, at the end of the activity book page. And so you'll notice here, it says pausing point 42. That means there are 42 activities for pausing points. So there were 4 days included in this unit for pausing points. What I will say when you're planning with teachers are some schools do not give those full 4 days. Some say we're going to do other things. We're going to, because of pacing, calendar, whatever it might be. So even if they do not have those days, I really encourage teachers, same thing with the teacher resources, to look at all of these activities in advance, kind of put sticky notes on the ones that you know your class will need extra practice with. Think about, could this be a morning work? Could this be a after recess, whichever it might be? Or do I want to send this home for extra practice? Because a lot of them are just practicing reading or practicing fluency, decoding. And so let's take a minute to look over. They start on page 84 of the activity book. So let's just take a few minutes to look over pages 8, and it's those 42. So we'll just take a minute. And if you want to look at it from the teacher end, you can open up the teacher's guide. The teacher's guide is going to have all of, let's see where it starts. The teacher's guide, it's going to start on page 215. Let's take like 2 minutes to look through the pausing point activities, and then we'll just share out what's included with the pausing points. pausing points are those kind of teacher flex days. We say flex days kind of carefully because we want to make sure that like it's flexible within reason. Like you still want to build towards those proficiency of the students, the skills that they're working on. But if a teacher wanted to do a different activity because they were seeing something else, they have. Bless you.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know I wasn't muted. Apologies, guys.
Anyone want to share out some noticings or what you are wondering from the pausing points, either in the teacher's guide or the activity book?
Kevin, for pausing point activities that connect to stories in the reader, are those stories that they have already read and then they're gonna like reread and do some workaround? Is that, or they're not reserved for the pausing point?
Which activity are you looking at?
Well, I'm looking in the grade 1 that we internalized, that that we worked on for pre-work, and I'm just looking at like Grand's trip home. And there's some questions about that, and Grand's mud run, and there's some questions about that. So I'm just wondering if that's
Those would be a reread.
Yep.
In third, fourth, and fifth grade, they have some pausing point activities that are new reads, or there would be like a cold read for those. But in K2, they are rereads.
Okay.
Kevin, this is going to be part question, part sense making. So I noticed at the beginning of the teacher's guide, it lists that there's 2 to 3 pause points at the end of the unit, but doesn't necessarily give guidance as it does in the knowledge part of the curriculum to like do lessons 1 through 4 and then put your first pause point after lesson 4. And then similarly, it looks like in the pause point activities, which seem just like a robust amount of them, they align to different skills that are being taught and practiced throughout the unit. So am I correct to infer that it's the teacher's job and or school, department's job to say, okay, we think that this would be an appropriate time to do a pause point during our unit because we're noticing from the student data that this is something they need more practice in. I'm going to pull the additional practice opportunity that's in the pause point resources and do it on day 5, say.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of schools will say like, finish this unit by this date, and they put in those 3 pausing point days. But the pausing points, really, there can be flexibility to say like, oh, I do need another day to reteach this, or I do want to use this pausing point activity. And I think the nice thing about these is like the pausing point activities can also be after the unit assessments. So they can be before the unit assessments to front load all of that. They can be after the unit assessments to like go over the unit assessment as well. So there is a lot of flexibility with where they fall. But correct, in the knowledge, it will say like typically in the middle of the unit and then typically right before the unit assessment. But with skills, there's a little bit more flexibility to kind of say like, no, we need to stop right now and we need to address these specific foundational skills.
And then ostensibly, if we're using student data to really drive when those pause points need to happen, it could be different. In my first grade classroom, we might do a pause point after day 4 versus across the hall, they might pause after day 7.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much.
Of course. And when you are doing, I think that this content in the beginning of the teacher's guide is so helpful. I think a lot of times we think of a table of contents and kind of be like, oh, there's not that much information. But this really does tell you, it's almost your snapshot of like a week. And I can see here, like lesson 1, I'm teaching the long E sound with EE. Lesson 2, we're doing common and proper nouns. Lesson 3, we're learning long A blank E. We're going to review a blank E. We're going to review they and their. This is like a nice snapshot to say, okay, in week 1, we're practicing E and A. In week 2, we're practicing I and O. And so just even like a snapshot there of thinking about like, I might want a pausing point after this day or after this day. In the teacher's guide, they're all listed right here, but they can be throughout.
Kevin, could you like be a teacher for a hot second and not teach us, but talk us through like pull up and show me like, okay, here's where I kept my data. And then I like the sense I made from it, like I have from the various checks that are built in and the assessments along the way. Here's how I would use that to decide, okay, we're going to do a pause point and it's going to focus on this skill. Can you just give me like a little example of how that would look?
Absolutely. So in the teacher resources, they have all of those record sheets. And so really you can use any of these record sheets to say, okay, I noticed from my anecdotal records that these 5 students really need to practice these vowels, or they don't know their tricky words, whichever it might be. So I would use any of these data collection sheets to then inform my pausing points. And it can be informal or formal. All of your more formal your formal activity pages are these here. And so with these can be in the teacher's guide. It will tell you how independent they can or can't be. I think sometimes teachers always wanted to push it to this is totally independent, and that's not the goal for all of these. The goal can be we can guide us through how to answer these questions. And so if it is more independent, you can use it as a data point. If it is more, we're doing this together, it can be more of a guided activity. But using any of these activity book pages and the teacher resource, those teacher resource record sheets as kind of using that to drive the instruction. In the beginning of the, I think it was in this unit, it talks about when there is a performance task. So I'm thinking about in lesson 18, there's going to be this performance task. I can look at what's included in lesson 18's performance task and think, do I want to pre-teach these things in lesson 17, or after lessons 18 and 19, do I want to have a pausing point day that goes over based on what assessment data I have from lesson 18 and 19? Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you. And Charlotte has a question just about, can you point us again to where the record sheets are within the teacher guide?
They're at the back in that teacher resources. So and I will look for what page it is. The teacher resources start on 252.
Okay, I have one more follow-up question. So most likely you're going to see that various ones of your kids need various things. So at that point, in your pausing point days, what is your recommendation for how teachers meet the varied needs across the classroom?
They don't specifically say whole group or small group. It really is kind of like we tell teachers, you know your teacher's better than everyone. There are a lot of materials there, but it could be the teacher splits the class and does 30 minutes with this half of the class, and 30 minutes with that half of the class. Or it could be small groups. It could be whole group that the whole class is guiding through activities. There's not like a one size fits all. It is just kind of best teacher practices for that specific classroom.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna ask one more question and
Oh,
then
please.
invite everybody else to get in because I'm dominating airtime. So do you all ever have schools that use those pause points cross grade and are like, we're gonna like this teacher is gonna take all the kids who need this and like kind of that walk to model? Do you have schools that do that? And if so, do you think it works well? Or is that like more hassle than it's worth given the number of days?
So the first grade, this is actually a great question. In first grade, the previous edition, it said have kind of like a walk to first grade skills. And it basically was like put the classes in groups of, this is like your above grade level group, this is your on grade below grade, if you have that capacity. They took that back and basically said like, keep your students in your classroom. Like the first grade teacher is the one that knows that those students the best. We do have, you all looked at the intervention toolkit at all? The intervention
I haven't
toolkit,
much yet. No, we referenced it the other day, but I haven't had time to get in there yet.
the intervention toolkit is a great resource because it has all phonics from kindergarten through third grade in one place. So if I'm a second grade teacher, but I have a student who's new and they didn't have this kind of foundational skills and skills before, I can pull up any phonological and phonemic awareness. So this is going to be like, all right, the sound hat, what sounds do you hear? At, and now let's change the to a at. So before we even represent these sounds with letters, it's just, can you hear these sounds? They have letter sound knowledge. So that would be like, all right, I'm going to show you the letter M. What sound does this make? Then I'm going to show you the letter, and then I'll say, point to the letter P. So this is just that one-to-one correspondence. Simple patterns would be CVC patterns. Complex patterns would be anything from like consonant clusters, are controlled, and it's all of these here. Consonant clusters, are controlled, digraphs, tricky spellings. They have worksheets, activities, games. It's helpful just because I can click are controlled and there will be a ton of, and this is tricky spellings, but there will be tricky spellings. So like if we're practicing that long E, we're practicing EA, practicing ooh. So all of these activities, they have worksheets, activities, games, sentences, and stories. And so all of this can be something that's done in class or sent home. And so we were talking about how do we help those third, fourth, and fifth grade students that might not have that foundational skills practice embedded. The intervention toolkit's a great place to look for materials, but I also think being able to print these out and send them home is also helpful as well. And I forget the question that you actually originally asked, and I don't remember if I answered it or not.
You did. It was about the like, do you guide to do a walk to model or to keep your kids? You did. Yep.
Right. I was like, I feel like I rambled for a long time and can't remember what the original question was.
Thank you for checking.
And then for the pausing points, do we feel good about knowing where they are, what activities are included, how the teachers can best use those days? Perfect. Read through the scope and sequence. So the scope and sequence is in the first unit. And so if I go back, if I look up skills 1, it's going to be, and I can just pull it up on my end, but it is in the back of the skills 1 teacher's guide. It has a detailed explanation of what's in each unit. And so for this part of the the unit planning process. It just says what was in the unit before and what's coming in the unit after. And so we'll just kind of read through what's in unit 1, 2, and 3. So unit 1, comprehensive assessments of reading skills, that BOY assessment. Review reading of and writing, CVC, CCVC, CVCC, and CCVCC words. We have some tricky words, oral blending and segmenting of sounds, chaining exercises, dictation, reading decodable stories, and answering questions. Unit 2, which is what they're in, we have these sounds E with EE, A, O, I, U. We have our tricky words, reading decodable stories, answering questions, chaining exercises. And then in unit 3, it's going to be oo, ow, oi, aw, reading 2-syllable words. So in unit 3, they're introduced to 2-syllable words. The tricky words would, because, could, and down, reading decodable stories, answering questions about stories in written form. They also are going to have weekly spelling words and assessments. And so they'll get into spelling in unit 3, and then the writing process, fictional narratives. And this is helpful. Even I have teachers just print this out and keep it kind of available just so they know as like a checklist. Okay, if I'm finishing unit 2, are students able to do this, do this, do this, do this, do this? And I can use that as like a quick snapshot for like, is my class ready for unit 3? Before unit 3, do we need to spend more pausing point days practicing these tricky words, practicing these decodable stories? And this is, it's called Appendix B, and it's just in the back of the grades K through 2 Skills 1 Teacher's Guide. I'll put that. All right, questions about planning for a skills unit. And then after we look at the unit, we'll do a lesson. So we'll look at the first lesson in this unit and think through, how do I plan for this specific lesson?
I think I feel good.
Amazing. All right, so we will use this daily lesson internalization process. There's really, so when we think about lesson planning, we're kind of, teachers don't necessarily have to lesson plan in terms of like copying and pasting the objectives, submitting a lesson plan to administrators. We tell administrators like, don't make them do more work than they need to. There's work that goes into planning for this, but it is not submitting a lesson plan. It's internalizing what are the objectives, what are the assessments, what are the standards, what are students expected to do. Again, it's not a scripted curriculum. It does guide you through it. And so we still need to think through like, how long are we spending on foundational skills? How long are we spending in reading? What's the objective of each of these components? But the main part is those first 5 steps. Steps 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 we will look at. But I think most of the time we guide teachers through those first 5 to really think through like, how do I teach this lesson? And then the following are kind of that additional or supplemental kind of to boost those lessons. So those first 3 processes, then we'll look at lesson 1, kind of guide us through those, is number 1 is review the primary focus objective and identify how they build towards student success with grade level requirements. Number 2 is complete the formative assessments identified on the first page of the lesson, including the activity book pages and the student reader chapter. Number 3 is complete the check for understandings and record what foundational skills students need to demonstrate to be successful on that check for understanding. So we'll look at these first 3 steps in the teacher's guide. Let me close out of all of these extra tabs. All right, so looking at lesson 1. our primary focus objective here. And so the title is the EE, the long E sound. Our foundational skills, students will read one syllable words with a, I, and Students will listen to and orally produce the E sound at the beginning, middle, and end of words. And students will read and write one syllable words spelled with the vowel digraph E. And I like looking at it kind of as a component. So I like to look at what are the objectives in just foundational skills and then get into what are the objectives in reading. So we're going to review the previously learned short vowels. We're going to listen and produce the E sound at the beginning, middle, and end of the word. If you remember, when we listen to it, it is just a phonological and phonemic awareness activity. So these words are not going to be in front of them. Then they will read and write one syllable words. For reading, as the teacher reads, Grand Strip Aloud, students will identify features of a sentence, as well as answer questions about literal and evaluative questions about key details, characters, and the main events of the story. For our formative assessments, we have the observation discussion questions from Grand Strip and activity page 1.2 Grand Strip. And I'll pull up the activity book pages. So that first one is going to be when we practice writing the sound E, practice corresponding the words. Grand Strip, where did Gran get to see lots of ships? What did Gran do at the Gulf? Which trip was Gran's best trip? Gran gets to Josh and Jen blank, and then that take-home letter for the parents. Saying we're practicing that double E as in feet. This lesson at a glance is really helpful to think about what is this 60-minute lesson going to look like. So I can see here that 35 minutes are on foundational skills. When I think about the pacing, and pacing is probably the trickiest thing for teachers in that first year because each skills lesson looks a little bit different with the timing. And so really making sure that I'm good with this 35 minutes, because if I'm not, then I might not have this full 25 minutes for the reading. And so same thing, I point teachers to this contents because this is a nice snapshot. So even thinking about, okay, Monday, 35 minutes on foundational skills, 25 minutes on reading. But look at if this is the second lesson or Tuesday, this is a pacing that like it has to be on, because if this is 5 minutes over and this is 5 minutes over and this is 5 minutes over, there's going to be virtually no time for that reading. So sticking to the actual pace of that lesson is important.
And I know this is an aside and we'll get to kind of our observations later, but in talks with Hillary, we talked like some of that could be adjusted. So if it's, let's say 10 minutes on a certain activity, instead of doing like 10 of the examples, maybe doing 5. And so there's that kind of flexibility when we get into actual implementation and observing that.
So what I tell teachers is, and kind of what Amplify says, is like stick to this 35 minutes for foundational skills. So like you'll notice here it says 10 minutes for the warm up, 5 minutes to introduce the sound, 10 minutes to introduce the spelling, 10 minutes to practice. Spend 35 minutes on foundational skills. So set a 35-minute timer and know in 35 minutes, I need to have these finished. But it's okay if this is 12 minutes and this is 3 minutes and this is 8 minutes and this, like, don't get too stuck in the like in the weeds of that, but make sure that like this is 35 minutes and this is 25 minutes, because this could easily be 45 minutes and so just thinking about kind of it as component is helpful. All right, so for the foundational skills, with that warm up, we're going to have our vowel code flip book, the individual code chart, and the green markers. These are reviewing those vowels that we already know. We're going to introduce the sound E. We'll introduce the spelling E, and then we'll practice the spelling E. And then for the reading, introduce the reader, teacher demonstrates reading grand trip, and then review grand trip. And so that was these first 2 years. So review the primary, review the primary focus objectives, complete the formative assessments. Let's also look at the student reader. It's not, so the teacher is reading this aloud, but I still want to, let me pull it up.
And Kevin, can you just can we pause on that point for a minute?
Yes.
That felt surprising to me that the teacher was reading that text aloud. How common is that in the skills block, and why?
So it is usually a model. And so it's to model pacing, to model like tracking from here to here. I feel like in the first unit, it's always going to be kind of a model. We'll notice even in 4th grade, you'll notice that lesson 1 is a read aloud. And so it's a model of, it's just guiding them through it. The rest of them will be more independent or partner.
Okay, yeah, I also had that question on 4th grade. Felt
Not
surprising.
read aloud.
Okay,
And so I always point teachers to like notice in the teacher's guide if it says read aloud versus if it says independent or with a partner. What I'll say is if it says read aloud, it should always be a read aloud. But if it does say independent, you can push towards as much independent as possible, but don't think that it means that like the teacher can't read parts or the teacher can't provide some of those scaffolds.
And just to clarify there, did I hear you say that it's usually a teacher read aloud model at the beginning of a unit, or is it at the beginning of when a skill is introduced? Or help me understand when does the teacher read aloud model usually come?
It's typically, and it looks different depending on the grade level, but let me pull up the so it says teacher demonstration. They reread the pet and this. So on lesson 3, this is when students have that opportunity to read the story. Teacher demonstration, read the swim meet, read the swim meet. So look, using this contents is really helpful because it does have that snapshot of like, this is what the students are doing, this is what the teacher is doing. All right.
and Kevin, can I just one more follow-up? I hear that and have a little bit of a worry, to be honest. And so I want to just raise it and see, like, from y'all's experience, how does this play out in real life? There's even more teacher read aloud than I was thinking there was of decodable text. So I get the knowledge strand in K2. But my worry about that is how much practice students end up having when the teacher is doing so much of the reading of the decodables. And I'm just wondering, in y'all's experience, do you see like, what do you make of that worry, I guess, is my question based on your experience? Because I worry about not enough practice for kids.
Absolutely. So with this one, they're reading it first without any interruption. So they're just modeling how to read the 4 pages, and then you go through it and the student will read the page and the student has that opportunity to practice it. So it's just the teacher guiding them through it once, and then they have their at-bat opportunity to practice.
Okay, so there's never a case where in the teacher demonstration, like, that's it. There's always a follow-on where the students are going to then read what was read to them.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. All right, the second part is to complete the checks for understanding. So let me look for the checks for understanding. Have students close their eyes and listen carefully. Tell students to raise their hands when they hear a word containing the E sound. Cheek, cheap, bed, meat, in, deep, bean, hen. So we're listening for, can we hear this sound? Any other check for understanding? Call on different students to answer each question. Note student performance in the discussion, indicating whether the answer was literal, inferential, and evaluative. And so there, we'll just answer these questions. So let's look through the actual lesson and start to think through, like, if I was teaching this tomorrow, how would I prepare for this? So let's, and I see some.
We're just having a side conversation about that same point about the teacher having read it aloud first. And like, the question is, how do we know the students didn't just memorize what was then read? And my thought is like, it's too much text in the reader. Like if that was happening on a sentence level, and
Yeah.
certainly on a word level, then you could just be repeating back from memory. But that's my take. What's your take?
There's 4 pages of this, so I don't think if they have a better memory than me. Okay, so starting with the foundational skills, we have those primary focus objectives. Let's look at this warm-up. This warm-up is 10 minutes. And we can actually do it through the digital experience to kind of look at what would the teacher's view on the digital experience be. I have found that most teachers use the digital experience for knowledge, and then not as many use it as much for skills. Not saying that's a better or worse, but for skills, I see that most of them use the print materials. Skills 2, lesson 1. I'm going to click teach. We're going to go over let's listen. We're going to practice a new sound. This is also in their Amplify hub. So students have access to this and teachers have access to this. So in grade 1, sounds, unit 2, we're going to practice the sound E.
E.
We also have a song.
Have you seen this beauty?
So you get the point. So let's listen. Do you hear the sound E in cheek, cheap, bed, meat, pin? We say E at the beginning of the word. Eat, each, east, eagle. Again, notice here that in the beginning of the word, none of these actually have the E spelling, but it is that phonological. Can you hear this sound E at the beginning? Now let's hear it in the middle. Peace, greet, meet, heat. Now let's hear it at the end. Be, me, key, tree. Let's watch. Oh, this is for the sounds library. This is when we practice the spelling. And so in that first 10 minutes, we go over the short vowels. We also introduce the new sound E. We hear it is in feet. And then we hear it in the beginning, middle, and end of the word. And then for the check for understanding, we're listening carefully to if they can hear the sound E in the word cheap, meat, deep, pen. How did that first 10 minutes feel? Thinking about those first 10 minutes of the lesson, reviewing the short vowels, introducing the sound E. We haven't introduced the spelling yet. It's just listen to this sound that we know in these familiar words. How do we feel like that pacing would be for that part of the lesson? The next 10 minutes are going to be introducing the spelling for E. You can use the handwriting guide for the spelling E. Short line across, almost a circle, short line across, almost a circle. They try not to stress the letter name quite as much just because they really want to focus on, and in this case, it is the letter E, but they want to make sure that we know that it's the sound E rather than the letter name. So not confusing the letter name and the letter sound. So they have 10 minutes to practice writing E on their hand, in the air. And then they have 10 minutes to practice going to, pull up their activity book, 10 minutes to practice this at their desk. And then they will practice reading these words. And this is the digital components, but all right, let's practice sounding out some of these words. Eat, eaten. So that was 35 minutes. How do we feel about the first 35 minutes of that lesson? Any questions on how to guide teachers through that? I've noticed that sometimes teachers just get a little overwhelmed with all of it can be kind of wordy for better or worse. I think for better is it really does guide you through it. For worse is if I haven't internalized it beforehand and I'm looking at this lesson for the first time, I'm going to say like, have students trace the spelling on their desk and point to like, that's not it. Don't get lost in that. Just know, okay, let's practice writing E on our hand. Let's practice writing E on the carpet with our finger. Let's write it in the air. But if they haven't internalized that before, it can feel not quite as rehearsed, as polished as it should be. So just making sure that teachers know to highlight this, put a sticky note to help guide their thinking. And then the reading portion is 25 minutes. Introduce the reader. In that introduction, we're talking about Gran. Gran likes to go on trips. Point to the apostrophe in Gran's name. That means possessive. We have our digital components. For this, we're saying, let's look at these tricky words. Let's look at the digraph Hong Kong, cling. And then also let's look at the E sound that we see in C, street, 3, steep, eels, feed. We're going to preview the core vocabulary: shrugs, steep, slick, cling, eels. Set the purpose for the reading. Tell students to listen to the story to find out what types of adventures Gran had in the Swiss Alps, Hong Kong, and the Gulf. We read it first with the teacher demonstration, and then we guide them through each page, and they ask these questions here.
Kevin, can I role play a teacher for a minute? Can I teach vocabulary as we're going through the text in the reading? Like as it comes up when I'm reading, can I reinforce it there instead of having a separate time to give definitions beforehand?
Absolutely. So we do want to just say, let's preview it, kind of introduce it, say we want to be on the lookout for these words. When we get to those words in context, that's when we want to kind of spend more time in that. If you are really running low on time, some parts of the lesson will have to be cut. If you feel like it's the best option to kind of cut that, but don't make it a common practice. It should be something that like, we do want to introduce this. We do want to call out what these words mean. Same thing with knowledge. We just kind of want to stamp what is the word that we're looking out for. What does it mean in this context? And then for those discussion questions, so I think Hillary was saying earlier, There are 7 questions here. If you are running a little low on time, prioritize the 2 or 3 or 4 questions that are the most beneficial and prioritize spending more time on those than rushing through all 7 and being like, literal, I'm going to call on this first student that always has his hand raised for each of these 6 questions. Exactly, align to that primary focus objective. Reviewing Grand's trip on 1.2. So students will have 10 minutes to practice this on 1.2. And this is where it is more independent. But again, it can be something that the teacher is working with a group. The teacher can guide them through this. So if the teacher says, all right, everyone turn to page 3, everyone read page 3. Now everyone answer question 1. The teacher can do that as well. So we want to push to as much independence, but it might look a little different depending on where your class is at. And then the take-home materials would be activity page 1.1. Additional support, so a lot of skills lessons will have some additional support activities. It's also helpful to put a sticky note in these because even if you don't have time to finish this today, this could be helpful at another point. So there's a lot of skills activities that are supplemental or extra practice. And so if you don't have time to get to this today, just put a sticky note or a reminder so that you can get to it at another point. Questions about the skills lesson 1, how to internalize that lesson.
Kevin, what do your most successful CKLA teachers usually have in front of them while they're teaching? Because to your point, like it's a lot. So
I think the teacher's guide, you need to have it in front of you just to kind of guide your thinking and say like, okay, I'm spending 20 minutes on the reading. Here's the 3 questions that I need to ask during the reading. They need to know the primary focus objective and they need to know kind of what are the steps to getting there. So I think a teacher's guide that's like clearly been internalized with sticky notes, highlights, pencil markings. All right. Do we want to jump to knowledge or do we want to take a 10-minute break or do we want to power through and end a little early? What are we thinking?
I'm sorry, Kevin. I just put a question in the chat because I want to interrupt you. But I was wondering, just by looking at how the lesson finishes, is there any type of debrief or something like to close the lesson or refer back to the objectives? Is there some kind of guidelines for the teachers on how to close? Because sometimes when you just move from one thing to the next, it's like the kids are like, oh, why would we even do that? So
Absolutely. So for the reading portion, says tell students to listen to the story to find out what types of adventures Gran had in the Swiss Alps. And then the questions that are embedded are asking about what types of trips did Gran have. So just revisiting like, what did Gran do in the Swiss Alps? What did Gran do in Hong Kong?
yeah,
We
I
have
was just
something, Paula,
sorry.
when we look at the IPG, there's something in there about kind of reviewing objectives and the purpose of each activity connected to the objectives.
Okay, thank you.
So do we want to jump right into knowledge 2? Do we want to take a break? What are we leaning towards?
Could use a stand and stretch, even though I just got a snack.
Okay, well, I'll set, so I see I'm on the West Coast, I see 9:22, so 9:32, I'll put a 10-minute timer up. right, let me stop the timer. I put in the chat a link for all of the read aloud videos. I would bookmark this. This can be shared with teachers. It's helpful. I think it's really helpful just to plan. So if I am a first grade, I will actually look at the second grade. So if I'm a second grade teacher planning for Knowledge 2, I can open up this YouTube link. I tell teachers, listen to all of it. It has lessons 1 through 14. Just listen to the whole unit on like speed 1.5 or speed 2, just so that you know what are we covering in this unit, just because it's helpful to know like what does lesson 1, how does that build to lesson 14. It can be hard to plan, like when you're thinking about the teacher's guide, it can be hard to kind of think about where are we going in this unit if I don't know much about early ancient or early Asian civilizations. And so spend 20 minutes kind of listening to all of the read alouds, just thinking about like, where are we going? What is the point of this unit? So I think that that's a helpful resource just to share with teachers to say, where are we going? All right, so let me make sure I close out of the tabs we don't need anymore, and then we will start with knowledge. So going back to that literacy rope, now we're thinking about how do we build language comprehension, knowledge, vocabulary, sentences, reasoning, mental models through the knowledge. Let's go ahead and go over. So in that pre-work, why is grade 2 knowledge 2 important? Early Asian civilizations. Why is this domain important? Anybody want to share out?
Kevin, why is the domain important, or why is the content of this lesson important, you mean? Or like, what is that what
So the first section of that unit introduction says like, why is early Asian civilization, why is that important for students to know?
well, it's the 2 most populated countries in Asia, and it's all about their ancient civilization and like what happened in the past that informs what things are happening today.
Absolutely. Thank you for stating with like, it is the 2 most populated country. Like it is where most of the people in the world reside. So it's just helpful to know about the history. So it's going to introduce students to the continents of Asia, those 2 most populous countries, India and China. And it talks about the important features of the early civilizations, from farming, cities, government, religion. That second section, and let me pull up the teacher's guide as well. So the teacher's guide, if I start at the very beginning here, just pulling from this, why is this important? The second section says, what are 3 to 5 key takeaways that students should have at the end of this unit?
They should understand they should understand the role that a river plays in a civilization being able to civilize itself.
Absolutely.
They need to
And I think-
understand the way in which Hinduism and Buddhism were forces in shaping early Indian civilization.
Absolutely. And this is important because I think that and I work in Texas a lot. And so Texas they feel, I think that they're just kind of like, why are first graders, why do they need to learn about Hinduism? Why do they need to learn about Buddhism? It is teaching them about how the religion is shaped from the land that they were living in. And so kind of those influences. So it's not preaching, it is in text, the context of this civilization is so connected to this religion. And so how is the religion based off of the features from the geology or the geography?
And something else, like overall, they're supposed to explain the importance of the geography of Asia and like the impact there, but then the writing is to describe like development over time. So those
Absolutely. Fantastic. How does this unit fit into the sequence of learning for the year? So let's go ahead and look at, this is the K-5 knowledge progression. So thinking about ancient Asian civilizations, what is this connected to prior early world civilizations? And then where does this build towards for later ancient civilizations? So this is grade 2. Previously, they learned about early world civilizations or early American civilizations. They're also learning about Greek civilizations. In 3rd grade, they'll learn about ancient Rome. They'll learn about the Vikings. So it's just thinking about not just historically, but geographically, historically. So thinking about where is this happening? When is this happening? And then also what is the, like, how does the land connect to their day-to-day life? Like we were talking about agriculture and rivers.
And this is where Charlotte's initial question, when we first started, really resonated for me. In the scripting, it would say, remember when we learned this or talked about this in grade 1? And so for those students who were not there, what is the, we need to think about
So
those
when I was teaching it, I taught 3rd grade, and our first year teaching it was a little bit of a mess because we were like, we started with ancient Rome, and I didn't know anything about ancient Rome aside from like Mean Girls, where they were like, we should all stab Caesar. That's really all I knew. And so I was like, but why are we stabbing Caesar? The goal of this is not to say they need all of this background knowledge to be successful in the unit. It's helpful to kind of frame that. It can also be a little overwhelming and feel like students need to be an expert on ancient Asian civilizations by lesson 1. That is not the goal. We're painting this picture one day at a time. And so don't feel like, oh, I need to show 10 different YouTube videos to set all this background knowledge. We're creating the background knowledge throughout this unit. So I don't know how many lessons it is, but over the course of 15 lessons, that's when we'll be experts or content, feel a lot more comfortable with early Asian civilization, not from lesson 1. So don't feel like they need to be an expert from this first lesson, but it builds throughout that. And so if teachers are in their first year and they don't have that prior knowledge, it is okay. We're not going to just say like, oh, well, they're not going to get background knowledge on this content, but it's helpful to know. So when I'm thinking about 3rd grade, they're learning ancient Rome. If they did have it last year, I can say, remember last year when you learned about ancient Greek? What's something you remember? Oh, I remember that they did this, they did this, they did this. That's just helpful for them to kind of connect it, but they don't need to know that to help build that content knowledge. But yes, I think that it can be a little bit of a harder, if we're starting it in 4th grade and 5th grade, when it's like, oh, this is great if they did have this in prior knowledge in prior years, but if they don't, it's okay. We're still going to become a content expert, but it's helpful if you can connect it. All right, so let's also look at the unit assessment. So in the unit assessment, I'm going to pull up the teacher's guide. To find the unit assessment, I'm going to go to the contents. So the domain assessment is on page 205. And let's just look at what do they need to be successful on this domain assessment. So the domain assessment is 3 parts. The first part is on vocabulary. So they need to know these vocabulary words. And then it's a thumbs up, thumbs down activity saying, can we talk about what the words sacred, emerge, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Indus River, conquer, the Yangtze River, defense, source, represents, unjust, durable, eager. I think it's really helpful, and I can show you an example. I think it's really helpful as you teach a unit, and I made this for 4th grade, but hang up a flipbook image, hang up a vocabulary word every lesson. So it's just like at the end of lesson 1, staple up a flipbook image from this lesson and staple up an activity book page. And it's not for the, I know we're not talking about geology, but just to think about like in this unit, what is the content knowledge that we're building? And for this particular unit, like the words that I really want to make sure that I'm practicing throughout are right here. So students should have the practice saying it, hearing it, saying it in a complete sentence, answering questions with these vocabulary words, because by lesson 15, we need to make sure that they understand these words. So it's just helpful for a teacher to plan this, like what words do I really want to make sure that students can hear, say, identify? Questions about that first part of the unit assessment? The second part is looking at a map. So let me pull up the second part. Identify Asia, India, China, the Himalayas, the rivers, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River. And so throughout this unit, making sure that like I have a content wall or some sort of knowledge that they can kind of connect these to when we're doing it throughout the unit. The third part is part 3, write at least one complete sentence to each question. Who is Confucius? Describe either the Chinese New Year or Diwali. How were rivers important to the development of early Indian and early Chinese civilizations? What is the most interesting thing you learned about Hinduism or Buddhism and why? So this is all for that unit assessment. Oh, Annie, I just saw your question in the chat and realizing that kids move in and out of schools and districts. So it's another reason beyond the adoption timeline that some students may not have. Exactly. And so just going back to that, don't feel like it is something that they need all of this content knowledge. I didn't know much about ancient Rome. It doesn't mean that I can't learn about ancient Rome. It's just helpful that if you did learn about ancient Greek last year, it's going to be helpful to just identify geographically, historically. Questions about that unit or domain assessments, part 1, 2, or 3?
I have a question.
Yes.
Our participant packet, like the pre-work we did, asked us what literacy skills will students need to be successful on the reading comprehension section of the unit assessment.
Let me pull up. I need to close out of skills now. Let me open up the participant notebook.
Let me go up. Yeah, right there at the bottom. Question 6.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was like, I don't know what the reading comprehension section is. Can you help me?
So what key components will students need? What's the key content? What is the key vocabulary?
Yeah,
What,
I got all that. This part, I was like, I don't know where that is. Where
So
is the reading
so
comprehension
there's
section?
not many for knowledge, and that's why the assessment looks just like a thumbs up, thumbs down. They try not to put too many literacy skills, but for this particular one in knowledge, so I would say for this one, they need to write a complete sentence about Confucius. They need to write a complete sentence to describe either the Chinese New Year or Diwali. How are the rivers important? What's,
Okay, that's the reading comprehension assessment.
what literacy skills will students need to be successful in the reading comprehension assessment other than
Section.
assessment? There's not a particular reading comprehension. I don't know why that language says reading comprehension. There's not a, for K2 knowledge, it's typically the vocabulary assessment, which is the thumbs up, thumbs down, some sort of activity page, but it's not a reading comprehension. And then a responding to some sort of comprehension question.
Well, that seems it might be the connection, like just comprehension questions, general comprehension, but not necessarily linked to any specific literacy skill.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I'll ask about the why it says the word reading, because it's not reading it. So much of it is read aloud.
Right. So I think, and Kevin, tell me if you have this, if you can answer this, or if I should pose this elsewhere. But one of my questions is, and there may be two different answers in K2 versus looking across to 3-5, but how is the work of like, all right, sorry, let me like try to get coherent on this question. So this tells us that students can remember and can write about what they learned, the core content, the knowledge that they should have gleaned through the unit. Part of which came from reading that they did, but that reading was done aloud to them given the grade level. So it's a lot about like, do you have internalized the core content of this unit, and can you write about it in a couple of sentences?
Exactly.
Okay. So my question is, where in the progression are students supported toward the transfer of those skills to the transfer of reading comprehension to a new content area? So in other words, okay, they can remember the content, that the core content, they've built this knowledge, which matters a lot in knowledge forward curriculum. But is there a way in which, like we know, for instance, that being able to summarize the gist is an important skill, that whether or not we're reading about ancient Asian civilizations or geology, we need to be able to summarize the gist of what we've read. We need to be able to, in the upper elementary grades, identify a theme. Where does that instruction happen? Can you help me on that question?
Throughout the unit, or you're saying from the unit overview?
Throughout a unit, and also as we look across the K5 spectrum.
Like summarize it. So we can, and we'll go into the PD library as well, but like for this specific unit overview, I would say like the big things for knowledge is just identifying like what content knowledge do students need to know. And so for this, it would just be content that they need to know is we're building towards this unit assessment. So can they kind of make connections? Do they know what this vocabulary word means? But for the like responding to the gist, I think that would be more in skills, because that would be more of like what happened in this reader. And so those activity book pages, and in first grade, it's not quite as deep, but like if we looked at a second grade activity book page, it's a lot more like respond to the text. And we saw it with Grant. Let me see here. Like this is the one that we were just looking at. Is this what you're asking? Like those comprehension from a text?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing me towards, in K2 at least, we would find more of that in the skills component, in the skills strand, sorry. That's where comprehension of text is gonna come. Knowledge that's built from text read aloud and activities you've done surrounding that comes in knowledge strand.
Correct. But I think both. There is a planning guide here that has all of the, let's see. There is a. I'll have to look for it, but it has every Common Core standard, and then it has when it's aligned either in skills or knowledge. And it's helpful as like a snapshot, but then it's also helpful for the unit itself, just to see like, is this a priority standard? If it's a priority standard, where is it embedded throughout the unit? Let me, oh, right, here we go. So it does it by unit. And so if I look at, this is for grade 1, this is going to tell you like, here's our standard. Is this a priority standard in this skills 1, knowledge 1? But then it also breaks it down into the individual lesson. It says like, within this lesson, is this a priority standard or not? So then teachers can think about like, okay, asking and answer questions about key details in a text, that's going to happen in skills 1 and knowledge 1. Retelling stories, that's going to happen in skills 1 and knowledge 1. Describing characters, it's only going to happen in knowledge 1, not as much in skills 1. Is that helpful? And
Yeah, thank you for pointing to that. I think I probably need to explore a little bit more, but that's helpful.
Kevin, can I ask another follow-up question to that? So this question that Annie is asking is making me think about something I saw in skills, which is these what we would more typically call like a reading comp assessment, like read the passage about Gran by yourself, I think with the passage about Gran, we would call it a warm read. And then answer some comprehension questions. But then I saw another assessment that was, I think, a fluency assessment about scouting that didn't have any connection to content knowledge that students were building either in skills or in knowledge. So that was like more a typical cold read. Is that a trend that you could call it the RL or RI, like 1 through 6 standard work would be done on warm reads, but the fluency checks are done on cold reads?
yeah, I believe so. And I'd have to look at the individual unit, but I know like in geology, the fluency is a cold read for that particular unit. I don't believe
Okay.
any fluency for passages that they've read before.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
And then I think Jessica has one more question in comments. Jess, you want to come off?
Oh, the alignment one that was a little further back. I guess as I think about language development and like the connections, if our primary focus objective is related to like explaining the impact of the geography on the civilizations, the questions afterward, not all of them like would reinforce that, or is there enough there that actually gets to make sure that we are like an assessment of that primary focus objective? Because then the writing is a little bit of a different topic.
Well,
I mean, connected, but not reinforcing.
a bit more once we get to the lesson, like the particular lesson study, and kind of look at like what's the primary focus objective here? What is the assessment? Is that assessment aligned to? But you're saying like your question is just asking about the alignment?
Yes, I guess so. Or just in general, that something I would be looking for is that the assessment aligns to the primary focus objective, or the writing aligns to what the primary focus objective was for reading. So the writing becomes part of the assessment. And as I look at those two, I was not seeing like a direct like reinforcement, I guess is what I'm naming.
I don't know how to. I think I'm confused.
Maybe it was just in the lesson that I'm thinking of. The maybe
Do
I
you want to
wasn't,
look at a particular lesson?
maybe.
Um,
We'll table that for now.
I was wondering just what you made of like to me, your question is, I interpret your question as, are we testing them on the content that has been deemed most important? Or is that where we're focused in our assessment? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
The formative assessment or the domain assessment?
I think you're
Um,
talking about domain, aren't you?
Maybe I need to go back and make sure I know what all of those.
Formative is
different levels.
daily. The formative would be like every day they have that activity book page or that respond to what we-
Whatever the writing was in the lesson that I was reviewing.
for a
The,
specific lesson.
Mhm.
So let's finish the unit, and then once we get into the lesson, we can kind of look at how do we plan for that lesson. Before the unit here, any other questions about like what content do students need to be successful on this unit assessment? And the unit assessment included those vocabulary words. It included the map of Asia, and then it included respond to those 4 questions. Any other wonderings from that unit assessment?
I have a question about the vocabulary assessment.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I just answered it.
Do we want to look at a lesson study now? Okay. Lesson study has a very similar process to the skills lesson study. So that first step is review the primary focus objective. The second one is look at the formative assessments or any assessments that the students will be doing in that particular lesson. So the checks for understanding. Do you want to look at lesson 1 or do you want to pull up a particular lesson?
I think lesson 1 is fine.
Lesson 1, okay. And same thing with that like snapshot here. The nice thing about knowledge is every lesson looks, they follow that same flow. So it's always going to be 10 minutes of introducing the read aloud, 30 minutes for the read aloud, 20 minutes for the application. The pacing for this, teachers will get into a flow of this. So I'll say just kind of like when thinking about how to best help teachers, pacing and skills is probably the most tricky thing because each lesson is a little different. Pacing for this will become pretty familiar. And so lesson 1, we'll spend 10 minutes introducing this unit, 30 minutes with the read aloud, 20 minutes for the application. And let me pull it up. So the Indus River Valley, part 1, speaking and listening. Students will review the key components of a civilization and locate Asia, India, and China on a map or globe. Students will review the importance of geography of Asia in the development of ancient civilizations in that region. Students will demonstrate an understanding of the tier 2 word fertile, and students will write a short description of the development of the early Asian civilization. And for that formative assessment, it says write about it, the Indus River, write a short description of the development of the early Asian civilization. And let me pull up that activity book page. So this is the map that they are learning about. Notice that it is very similar to the map that they have on their unit assessment. And then write about it, the Indus River. So once we learn about the Indus River, then they'll write a few complete sentences about the Indus River. They also have a caregiver letter saying, what is this unit about? They do have these in Spanish to send home just to say you can ask your kids about what they're learning about in the content. Here is our lesson at a glance. Our advanced preparation. The advanced preparation, don't think about it as like, this is all this extra work that the teacher needs to do. It's just saying like, what should I have pulled up on my computer? And then the next part of that unit, complete the formative assessments. So we'll look at the complete formative assessments. Check for understanding. What was a civilization able to form in the Indus River Valley on the continent of Asia? Or why was the civilization? What caused the Indus River to flood in the spring? What did the flood waters leave behind? And how did the fertile soil help people living near the river? So this is that evaluative. Again, it would be helpful to have like a class roster or something so that you could keep up with, I'm not calling on the same students a few times. Then we'll start with that core vocabulary. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vocabulary words. When we're introducing them, again, we don't want to say like, here's 5 pictures and here's this. We just want to say, all right, we're listening for 5 words today in today's story, and we're going to do our elephant ears or something to show that we listened. One is the word common, cultivate, fertile, Indus River, and irrigation canals. And so once we get to them in the read aloud, that's when we'll pause and say cultivate. What did that word cultivate mean? Common. What did the word common mean? Each lesson, or I'm sorry, each unit starts with a core connection. The core connection is just going to connect it to any prior knowledge. And so we're talking about what prior knowledge do we have? We will talk about what is an ancient civilization. We'll show some pictures of ancient civilizations. And then we have our read aloud. And the purpose of this read aloud is to listen closely to find out where these civilizations developed. So we'll learn about the Himalayan mountains, the river flooding its banks, images of the 2 cultures, the Egyptian and the Aztecs, the Indus River, and then our comprehension questions here. So where did this civilization develop? How did the Himalayas contribute to the formation of the civilizations in the Indus River? What was the purpose of digging irrigation canals? What were some features of the Indus River communities that were common among ancient civilizations? Let me jump back to this. And numbers 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Review the read aloud and prioritize which sidebar supports. So those sidebar supports, thinking about how can I make this more rigorous? How can I make this more accessible? How can I make it more accessible for the emergent bilinguals or multi-language learners? Review the discussion questions. Prioritize which discussion questions you want. So if you are only going to pick 3, which 3 do you feel like are the most common? Don't feel like you need to rush through all 10 if you really want to spend more time on 3. What possible misconceptions might students have? What additional engagement might you incorporate? And then plan for the application segment. Consider how the application activities provided students with the opportunities to extend their learning. Determine how you execute those activities. So looking at 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, thinking about how do I want to kind of assess this here? Do I want this to be more teacher-led and I'm providing sentence starters? Do I want this to be more of a baseline assessment to see what they did? Not all activities, not all formative assessments need to be a grade. So just thinking about how do I want to administer and what do I want to use this data for? Do I want it to be baseline data or do I want it to be more teacher guided? So number 5, we'll look at those discussion questions. Where did this civilization develop? How did the Himalayas contribute to the formation of the civilization in the Indus River? What was the purpose of digging irrigation canals? And what were some features of the Indus River communities that were common among ancient civilizations? So if we look at writing about the Indus River, there are 4 questions here. So where did this civilization develop? The Indus River. How did the Himalayas contribute to the formation of the civilization in the Indus River? What was the purpose of digging irrigation canals? And what were some of the features? These are all going to help students with that formative assessment, thinking about like, where is this river? How is it helping for this ancient civilization? Let me jump back to number 6, possible misconceptions, just thinking about like, because this is a brand new continent for some students, thinking about like, how can I be clear about where we live versus where this is and the time frame of, we're not talking about today, we're talking about thousands of years ago. So I think that location and also timing could be possible misconceptions. What additional engagement might you incorporate? I think that making sure that you have equity of voice. I also have a slide later here talking about sparkle. Sparkle can be anything just to make enhancing it. And so could I ask the music teacher or art teacher, we're starting this unit on ancient Asian civilizations. Could you do an art craft, or does the librarian have a book, or can the PE teacher make a game out of it? Can I create a content wall or trade books? So there's lots of engagement that can happen in the class and also outside the class. I see some in the chat. Dr. Jessica, I see that you said this page is what I was referring to. What page was?
Page 6. The lesson primary focus objectives. And so from just a linguistic standpoint, as I look at the reading and the focus is on explaining the importance of geography, I was expecting, I guess, the writing would be connected to that. So as we're reading, we're kind of naming how the author is setting up this relationship of like, why these are important to the civilizations, and then using those in the writing. So we're like apprenticing them into that by using the text. And so that's why I was just thinking, obviously they're both important, but that's when I was saying like the alignment between the two is what I was curious
about. I think I'm still, so wait, you're saying you feel like the writing does not match up with the reading?
What I hear, oh, sorry, go
Thank
ahead.
you, Annie. Annie's
No,
a good
go ahead.
translator. No, you're a good translator for me. Go.
Well, tell me how I do. What I think I'm hearing is not that it doesn't match up, but that within the reading section, one piece that would be important, I think for all readers at this grade level, but particularly important for multilingual learners, would be understanding, okay, if the primary focus objective of reading is about the importance of the geography of Asia and the development of that civilization, of those civilizations, then how is the author of that text, what language features is the author doing? What is the structure of that text that is helping accomplish that point for the reader? So as a reader, I'm learning about different types of structures of language, structures of text as a whole, that are supporting meaning that an author is trying to get across. And then I can like flip that. And when I'm writing, I can say, well, if I'm being asked to write about the importance of the geography, the importance of rivers in particular, then there are text structures and language features that I watched that author use that now I need to mirror in my writing. Am I getting what you're laying down,
Wait,
friend?
and you're saying that you don't feel like these are aligned, or
Go ahead. I'm not sure what your answer.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm just getting too granular again.
okay. I also want to point out that the core content objectives are also listed in that unit internalization. So just thinking about as you do go throughout this unit, using this as a checklist, thinking about like, can we locate Asia, India, China on a map? Can we explain the importance of the mountains? Can we explain the importance of the Indus and the Ganges River? Do we know the key components of a civilization? So like these are the content objectives that students need to have. And then it also includes that writing of identify the facts and information before the read aloud, and they will practice synthesizing information, note taking. They will practice working independently to write 1 to 3 sentences responding to the read alouds.
Kevin, can I ask can I shift gears just slightly and ask a question about the comprehension questions at the end?
Of course.
So with, let's say, question 3, I'm the teacher. I've already done the read aloud. We've talked about all of the content. We get to question 3. I re-show the image of the irrigation canals, but there is no text on that image, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then I ask the question, what was the purpose of digging irrigation canals? Let's say my students don't remember, or like I'm getting answers that are either I'm getting crickets, or like we just don't have it. We don't have the answer. Is there a text? Let me check for my understanding. Amplify's recommendation would be at that point for me to go back to that part of the text where the answer is and reread it aloud for students and then ask the question again.
Yes, correct.
Is there ever a world in which you would recommend to display any sections of text during this part of the lesson? No.
No, because these texts are all above grade level, meaning that like this is not a second grade level text. This is a second grade read aloud, which is higher than a second grade. Like the second grade reader is not going to look like the second grade read aloud. So the text should not be in front of them. It's just a read aloud. Okay, we have about 45 minutes. Are we good to jump to 4th grade? Okay. Let me close out of these tabs and start with 4th grade. So why is the 4th grade unit 5 on geology? Why is this unit important?
Anybody else want to jump in? I'm happy to answer. Give my take. Okay. Well, here's what I would say. We live on this planet called Earth. That planet is has been made over billions of years, and the way that that heat and pressure work to cause movements in the earth result in different geological features that we can see on the surface. So things are happening inside that are making what we see on the outside. And so understanding those relationships between those processes and their impact on our geography at the surface and the various environments that we live in is critical for understanding the planet that we call home.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And a lot of these we can see with our eyes, but then some of them we can't see with our eyes, like the tectonic plates. We can't really see that. We can see the impacts of these tectonic plates. We can see or feel an earthquake or a tsunami, or we can see a volcano, but we can't see the plates themselves shifting on the day to day. So some of them are more abstract, but thinking about like the relationship between the things that we can't see and the things that we can see. So explains the relationship between different geological processes and shows how these processes affects Earth's landscape related to environments. What are 3 to 5 key takeaways that students should have by the end of this unit? Earth is continually changing through the tectonic plates, the rock cycle, the earthquakes, and the tsunamis, the volcanoes. For the formal writing piece, students are going to examine and explain similes. They'll talk about the tsunamis informational packet. They're going to have a volcano wiki entry, and then they'll have a rock cycle descriptive paragraph. And this is all in rock cycle descriptive paragraph. They're going to use personification to describe, like, I think the example was Leah the rock, and what Leah is like personified as a rock, using personification, alliteration, and similes. How does this unit reinforce what was taught in previous units? In kindergarten, they learned about taking care of the earth. In first grade, they learned about astronomy. In second grade, they learned about nature, cycles in nature. Let's start and look at the unit assessment. So the unit assessment, let me pull up. The unit assessment is going to be on page 352. So
Kevin, while you're doing that, can I just share another key takeaway that I thought of when I was doing the pre-work? Like I saw that I think it was in first or second grade, students learn that there's this thing called geology and this career called a geologist. Like they're oriented to that. And so I thought it was just exciting if that piqued someone's interest, that once you get to fourth grade, you go way deeper into geology and just get to understand on a more nuanced way what different like versions of geology there are. And maybe that leads to like studying geology in undergrad, or I just thought that that was like a cool key takeaway and thorough line.
absolutely. So the unit assessment is on lesson 15. It's going to start with the spelling assessment. And I will, after we look at the unit assessment, we'll go back to spelling and talk about how we teach spelling. But the unit assessment is going to be 75 minutes, and it's on page 15.2 in their activity book. So let me open up 15.2, and then we'll kind of talk about what's included in this assessment. Okay. Oh, that's the middle of your assessment, not that assessment. 15. They are reading Earth's forces at work in Japan. And then they're answering some comprehension questions here. What causes earthquakes in Japan every year? Part A, Part B. Using numbers 1 through 3, rank the 3 major earthquakes Japan has experienced. And then why was the earthquake you labeled as the strongest in Part A also the most destructive? Number 3, in paragraph 5, what does the word advanced mean in the following sentence? Number 4, how does Japan's earthquake early warning system detect movements in the earth? Number 5, why did Japan's earthquake early warning system only give 15 seconds of warning to people in Sendai before 2011? How does the volcano in Nishima off Japan's coast acting as a creative force? So let's look at these questions here. And this is on page 5. Here we go. This is on page 362. It's the unit assessment analysis where it just talks about like this literal, inferential, evaluative. So they'll read the first passage, answer these comprehension questions. Then they will read the second passage, earthquake myths, and then answer some more comprehension questions. And those comprehension questions start on 8. So inferential, evaluative. And then the last one is they will respond to this writing prompt. Write an essay comparing and contrasting the causes and effects of earthquakes you read about in Japan and in both myths. Discuss how the causes and effects of earthquakes are similar and how they are different, providing at least one example from the text for each similarity and each difference you identify. So for the unit assessment, they're reading 2 passages, answering comprehension questions, and then comparing and contrasting the 2 passages. Kind of just like overview of what's there. So let's see. So list the key sections of the assessment. For the unit assessment, it's going to start on 15. They have those 2 passages, comprehension questions for each. After that, they also have a grammar part. For this grammar part, they need to insert a comma and then also use quotation marks. So for the grammar in this unit, we're going over commas and quotation marks. And then for the morphology, they are going to choose the correct word to complete the sentence. Any questions about just like overview of those unit assessment components? We'll dig a little bit deeper into like each one of those components in a, because this next question says, read through the reading comprehension section and determine what makes this text complex. Okay, this is, I think, a really helpful task to do as a teacher, because sometimes teachers might say, this test is too hard for my students. And so the goal is not to say this test is too hard. The goal is to kind of identify what specifically makes this text complex. And then from there, identify how can we make it more accessible for the teachers. And so I went ahead and read the text and kind of highlighted any tier 2, tier 3 words that might be really tricky for students. And so the teacher can say, when we're introducing it, if it's the vocabulary that's complex, we can say like, okay, we're going to talk about some of these words. I want you to underline this first word, namazu, and I underline it right here, or you can highlight it, whichever it might be. I'm thinking about like, now, what is namazu? Namazu right here is a giant catfish whose nickname is Earthshaker. So when we see that, what are we going to think about? Another one is Kashima, the Japanese god Kashima. So just thinking about if it is the vocabulary that is complex, how can I kind of provide a little bit of scaffolding for that? Tectonic plates, subduction, we've already talked about that in the unit. tsunamis, seismographs, that's included, volcanoes, those are included in the unit. So they're taking the content knowledge and this cold read to kind of form that. But let me also pull up this text complexity guide. This is in your participant notebook. So when we're thinking about a cold read, typically in nonfiction texts, the text structure, it's organized in a way that's easier to read because we understand like there's subheadings or it's organized in that way. And then typically in a fiction text, the text structure, it might be organized in different scenes or different settings or kind of it's so most of the time text structure is slightly complex for nonfiction because we're following that flow. Language features are typically a little bit more complex because we have vocabulary, the sentence structures. This might be a little bit more complex. The purpose, thinking about why did the author write this, and then the knowledge demands. So because we just had 15 or 14 lessons on geology, is the subject matter really complex, or is this something that they've learned about? And so once we read over this, it just talks about a myth that was in Japan about the tectonic plates. They believed that it was a giant catfish that was getting upset and smacking its tail. And then in the other myth, they believe that it's enormous turtles that are swimming. And so I don't know how much time we want to spend on here, but any thoughts on how to use that, or any wonderings about how to use that text complexity rubric when looking at the unit assessment?
Kevin, just for my clarity, if you all are providing guidance to either leaders who are leading PLC type work or to teachers directly on this, are they supported? Do you all support them through that process of like taking this text and then looking at the rubric and then saying like, okay, so let's talk about how to scaffold up to the particular pieces that make this, or components or reasons that add complexity to this particular text? Is that what happens?
Typically, yes. So when we do this unit internalization process, we'll look at this unit assessment and say like, what makes this text complex? In this particular text, it's like the sentence structure is not too advanced. It's not the sentence structure, but it could be some of this vocabulary. And so just thinking about this namazu, we can underline that and say like namazu in this first paragraph. And again, it's with these unit assessments, the scale of how much support you give, it can be a rolling scale. I think sometimes teachers just give it to them and don't support their students at all. That's not the goal of a unit assessment. The goal is that by the end of the year that they can complete this independently. But if we need to provide support throughout it, you can absolutely scaffold and say, okay, let's read this first paragraph together. Tell me, what is namazu? What is Kashima? So that they kind of like frame that. Whereas I think if they just kind of read into it and maybe don't really pause for that, they might have a harder time identifying that. So I think calling out in that unit internalization process, what makes it complex, and then thinking about like, how do we want to scaffold that? Even for the writing, if you want to talk about what sentence starters do we want to have? What do we want to include a word bank? Do we want to include transition words? So just thinking about what scaffolds would be appropriate for your particular class. It could also be something that maybe we read the first passage as a class and the second passage is more independent. So there are lots of scaffolds that teachers can make and that we kind of guide them through how to to use the unit assessment. Questions on that unit assessment?
Can you remind me of the page again? I want to bookmark the rubric for the text complexity.
The text complexity rubric, like where you have access right now. It
Yes.
is in the participant notebook, but for teachers, they can find it in the PD library.
Okay. The library is what I'm thinking.
And then for the grammar, using that comma and quotation marks. And then the morphology, finishing those sentences. Let's go ahead and look at a lesson and think about, let me make sure. Oh, and what fluency will students need? Student to be in the 50th percentile, they will need to read 110 words correct per minute. And this is just a screenshot from the teacher's guide. What morphology and grammar, commas, quotation marks, and complete the sentence. For the lesson internalization process, we're going to follow a similar flow. Are we good with looking at lesson 1 again? I also forgot to
Sure.
mention that the middle of year assessment also comes in this unit. So for the middle of year assessment, there are a lot of parts to the middle of year assessment. Again, we were talking about if schools use M-Class, they don't need to do all of the components of this. But I highly recommend for students that are reading below grade level, give that word reading in isolation or M-Class, just so that you know what do students need in that word recognition. And then from that word recognition, going into the toolkit and saying, here's some practice with multisyllabic words, here's some practice with ZVC words, whichever they need. So it will really call out here, what skills do students need to know how to read? And then you provide that in the intervention toolkit. So for lesson 1, we have 2 objectives. Identify the different areas of study about the Earth and ask the types of questions geologists ask about the Earth. That's core connections. So every lesson 1 is going to have that core connection.
What does that term mean, Kevin? Core connection?
It's building the background knowledge. So it's setting the scene for what is this unit. So this is just going to introduce
Oh.
what geology is.
Okay, so we'd say that at the beginning of knowledge units only. Okay,
Knowledge
gotcha.
unit, and then 3rd through 5th grade, every single content, like every unit is going to start with this.
Okay.
Reading, students will be able to describe how people's knowledge of what happens on Earth's surface has changed over time, including explaining the continental drift hypothesis and the existence of Pangea. Let's look at those activity book pages. 1.1, 1.3, 1.4. Read the questions related to the areas of study about the Earth, discuss the questions with your group, and identify those that relate to the area of study on your group's card. So it's just asking about what are the names of the oceans? What are the names of the continents? What causes changes in an ecosystem? The core connections are also helpful because the teacher can see how much background knowledge are students bringing into this. Maybe somebody's dad is a geologist and maybe they've only lived in a desert and don't really know any other kind of ecosystems or so. It's helpful to kind of gauge where your class is at for the background knowledge. 1.2 is going to have all of the vocabulary words. So I know that this can be overwhelming for one particular day, but again, these are going to be reviewed throughout the unit. And so students will have this in front of them during the read aloud. Teacher's just going to introduce them and say, once we get to them in context, then we can talk about it a little more. Evidence collector's chart, talking about the cause and what evidence is there. So what is the cause? At some point, Pangea broke apart and the pieces slowly moved apart over a long period of time. What evidence is there? Tectonic plates move very slowly due to the heat and pressure in the mantle. What evidence? And this is for both of those. Let me look at what we do. So for the core connection, introduce the area of study, tell them that we're learning about geology. Explain that before the reading of the chapter, you'll discuss what students may already know about the Earth. Geography is the study of characteristics of Earth's surface. Ecology is the relationship between the living things and the environment. And archaeology is the study of past life and activities. This is that, and there would be, let me check the timing, 45 minutes for this core connection. So 45 minutes to kind of set the scene or set the stage for what this is about. Introducing geology as the area of study. Talking about Grand Canyons, fossils. And then the reader itself. Notice here that, again, the read aloud for chapter 1. So you are guiding them through, or the teacher is guiding them through that reader. That text complexity rubric is also helpful for thinking about these readers as well. And chapter 1 might not be the best example because it is a read aloud, but as you look at chapter 2, thinking about like what specifically makes chapter 2 complex? Is it the vocabulary? Is it the structure? And I can pull up that. We were looking at it a little earlier, but just thinking about like typically in a nonfiction text, the structure is organized well because there's text features, there's headings, subheadings, there's graphics, because that, like if we're learning a seismic wave, there will be a picture of a seismic wave there. So typically in nonfiction, the text structure is not as complex. The vocabulary is more complex. The knowledge or the subject matter is more complex. And the purpose is not as complex because the purpose is clearly stated in the chapter. If this chapter is about, I can look here. So this chapter is Earth's changing surface. How did people understand what was happening with Earth's changing surface? Like the purpose of this chapter is just to tell me about Earth's changing surface. The author's not trying to hide that. Whereas in literature, the purpose might be a moral or a theme, something that's kind of hidden and more abstract that you need to think about and not clearly stated. So typically in literature, that's more complex. The sentence structure might be complex, but and the text structure might be complex if you're changing scenes or things like that. So just identifying what makes it complex and then thinking about how could you scaffold that appropriately. For the read aloud, you're going to ask these questions as you're reading. So read page 2 and 3, ask these literal questions. You have your sidebar supports. Read page 4 and 5, ask these questions. Read page 6 and 7, ask these questions.
Kevin, to pause this again, this is another example of where, because now we're in grade 4, we're not in the 2 strands, we're in integrated. Because this is the first text within this unit, that's why we see the teacher doing most of the read aloud here. Is that right?
Yes, and so you'll notice here for lesson 2, it'll say dependent or let's see, introduce the chapter, have students read page 12 and 13 silently. And it's pushing to that, and it could be with a partner, but like chapter 1 is always I'm guiding you through this entire thing. We're setting the stage. So it's always going to be a core connection. Everybody's on board, and then pushing towards more of that independence.
Thank you.
I also wanted to call out the spelling because I think that spelling can also be kind of confusing for some teachers. Let me look up. So for spelling, and I don't remember if I mentioned this or not, using this code chart is so helpful because if the spelling word is like, we did it yesterday, monarchy, we're going to break it into its syllables, mon-ar-key, and then we're going to look up based on the consonants and vowels. So we have 2 pages of consonants, 2 pages of vowels. We're going to look up each of those sounds, ah, and use that power bar. And so the spelling is always connected to the code chart. And so it's just saying spelling is not memorize this list of words on Monday and your test is on Friday. Spelling is identifying, have students learn how to use this code chart. And so when we're introduced, so in monarchy, the tricky spelling is that CH, but most of the words on that spelling list have that tricky spelling of with the CH. And so the point is to say like, when is with the CH versus when is with the CK. So it's just about identifying a pattern and then remembering how to kind of use that. I tell teachers you can absolutely use this on a spelling assessment. So when you introduce the spelling words, have them use this, and then maybe on your first couple spelling assessments, allow them to use this as well. It's supposed to be intended as a guide. So rather than students saying, how do I spell this word? It can be, how many, do I hear the phonemes in this correctly? Am I identifying this correctly? And let me pull up another example of a spelling, because I think it's helpful to see in context.
Kevin, while you do that, it's helpful to know that's an option for them, and that that's one source of spelling knowledge. Like that's one, like, you know, the you're pointing them towards phonology for spelling. Is there any, are we also prompting them or teaching them about either etymology or, like, you know, language of origin stuff, or I know there's a lot of morphology, so I would imagine those pieces are also coming in here. Is that right? For like
Yes.
why you spell as you do?
The spelling words are either content specific. So if they are, like, if they're for the Reformation, there might be a lot of words that are very content specific to that. And so it might not follow the traditional English spelling. And so it is both of those. So it's morphology. And then also if it's content specific, it's going to talk about the origins of that. But it does stress syllabication, which is important. And so I think that, but what I've seen is 4th and 5th grade teachers don't really, they're not as familiar with the syllable types. They're not as familiar with how to like help them decode or encode. And so it's helpful to really say here, like enjoyable, let's tap it into its syllables, enjoyable. And then let's look up all of those phonemes, n, n, joy, j, boy. And then see here, like, how are these? Is this the most common spelling or is this a tricky spelling? So I feel like the teacher's guide shows them this, but I don't know if they often use this. I think that sometimes spelling can be tricky for them and they just think of it still as memorizing a list of words. Let me jump back into with the reading. Here are our wrap-up questions. Again, if a teacher hasn't really internalized it beforehand, it can be easy to kind of lose focus or lose sight of this. And so just point them back to what is the objective here? The objective is that you'll be able to describe how people's knowledge of what happens on Earth's surface has changed over time, including explaining continental drift hypothesis and the existence of Pangea. And so the question should all point back to that primary focus objective. Want to show activity page 1.5. This is a take home. So again, we saw it a little bit earlier, asking if they have that, the Black Line Masters. They don't have a particular one for any K-5, but the activity books often have a lot of take home materials to practice reading and then to apply their knowledge. Pause here. Questions? We have about 10 minutes left. Questions about how to guide teachers through the unit or the lesson internalization process. All right, we have a little reflection here. The first one is, what questions do you have? And then the second one is, what do you anticipate teachers will need the most support with for either the unit or the lesson?
I think I have a question about your just anecdotal experience with the beginning of 3rd grade in your support with schools. Like the format of K2 curriculum feels different than the format of 3-5. I've been doing read aloud. I've been listening to read aloud, and now all of a sudden, I've got this like reader in front of me. Did you find in your own experience or in support with schools, do you find that there's a little bit of a adjustment period there? Like, do students struggle with that typically in the beginning of 3rd grade?
No, because 3rd grade has speaking and listening every day. And so 3rd grade is that blend. So K2 is 2 1-hour lessons. 3rd grade is 120 minutes in one lesson, but it includes both. So 3rd grade still has that speaking and listening. So every lesson in 3rd grade includes a read aloud, where they still, so it's blend, it's fusing the two. And then 4th and 5th grade, there is no read aloud where there's no text in front of them. There is read aloud in the lesson, but in 4th and 5th grade, they always have the text in front of them. 3rd grade is the last grade that they don't have that text in front of them. For some, but all grades have a read aloud and a reader, but it 3rd grade fuses it and like blends it, whereas K2, it's the skills and the knowledge.
Kevin, would you mind, I know we're right here at the end, but would you mind just pulling up a 3rd grade lesson for a second? Just so we can see how the time is spent and
Yep.
how read aloud and students reading on their own works. Yeah, like even this is helpful.
So it's always going to be reading and read aloud, reading and read aloud in 3rd grade.
But on the same
Yep.
content.
So on the same content, and it's always going to be, so let's look at an example. So let me go to a little bit further in. So this is on animal classification. So read the reader. This one is on, let me go later in the chapter. Vertebrates or invertebrates. So for speaking and listening, they're going to talk about vertebrates and invertebrates and in reading as well, but it's just on a reading level versus on a speaking and listening level. So the chapter that they're reading versus the speaking and listening, where this is what they'll have in front of them. This will be projected and this is what they're reading. So it's both on the same content, but it's more so like listen and learn, read and learn.
And in the same way as in K2, they're seeing the image while the read aloud happens. Not okay.
Correct. So the speaking and listening portion, of this is when they'll have an image with no picture and the teacher's reading from the text. The reading is in the reader.
Okay. Charlotte, thank you for asking that question.
Any other clarifying questions? And I feel like K5, there's a big difference between a kindergarten classroom and a 5th grade classroom. So there is a lot to it. So it's a lot to internalize. I also, just going back to this, I think that what do you anticipate teachers will need the most support with? I have found that teachers can get lost in the content, thinking that they are like, students are really excited because the students do like the content. And so like for animal classification, they'll change it into a science lesson. And so they'll lose sight of the reading objectives or the writing objectives. And so it's kind of tricky that you want to say like, the content is obviously very important, but like this is a reading lesson with the lens of this, but don't show a 10-minute YouTube video on animal classification because that's not the goal. The goal is to like compare and contrast or talk about cause and effect with the lens of animal classification, with the lens of ancient Rome. So I have seen that teachers will do things that they feel like are helpful, but if it's not building towards proficiency of that primary focus objective, it's taking away from the integrity of the lesson or the unit. So thinking about backwards planning, it's helpful to look at that unit assessment, that culminating writing. Encourage teachers and leaders to prioritize activities that will support students in becoming increasingly automatic in their word recognition and increasingly strategic in their language comprehension. And ensure instruction is aligned to those primary focus objectives. It's also helpful, like we were talking about earlier, throughout the unit, staple up one thing every day. So lesson 1, we learned about this. Lesson 2, we learned about this. Lesson 3, we learned about this. Lesson 4, we learned about this, just so that they can see it kind of in one cohesive spot. And I tell this to kindergarten all the way up to 5th grade, just so that they can see like how it builds. Sometimes it can feel like each day is a separate lesson. And so students aren't able to make that connection quite as much. And so if they can see like, oh, right, we learned about the tectonic plates, and then we learned about seismic waves, and then we learned about this. It's helpful to kind of build on. We talked about this sparkle. And then, okay, so let's look at our objectives. Identify key concepts from the unit and lesson planning that have deepened their product knowledge. Apply the unit and lesson internalization process, and then examine the shift educators will need to make when implementing CKLA. We have about 3 minutes left. Any clarifications, questions, wonderings? I can show you in that PD library where a lot of things are. So if I click PD library, scroll down and click CKLA. And then I'm using this as a guide for what I want to look for. So all things for reading, I would click reading. They have routines and look fors. These are helpful just to call out, like, what am I looking for in a lesson? It's almost like a checklist of, am I doing this? Am I reviewing the vocabulary? Am I doing this? These are helpful for teachers. And then they also have that text complexity rubric, the reader lexiles. So there are a lot of resources in here for teachers. How to read multisyllabic words. It talks about magnet escape. So lots of resources in here. All right, well, thank you all for your time today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you, Kevin. And just to ask,